Have you ever had that strange feeling that someone was watching you, even when there was absolutely no one around? You're alone, focused, maybe working, using your phone, or simply walking when suddenly something changes. A subtle shiver, a pressure that's hard to explain, and the clear impression that there's an invisible gaze directed at you. You look around, check the surroundings, but find nothing. Still, the feeling lingers for a few seconds. If this has ever happened to you, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. This experience is much more common than most people imagine. It's not rare, nor necessarily strange, and certainly not a sign of excessive imagination. In fact, feeling like you're being watched is part of a set of curious phenomena in the human brain, linked to how it interprets the environment, anticipates dangers, and constructs the reality around us. The most intriguing thing is that, in these moments, the sensation seems real. The body reacts, the focus shifts, the heart races slightly. Everything happens as if someone were actually there. Perhaps you've experienced this at home, at night, in silence, or walking alone down the street, or even in a crowded place, when for a moment you get the feeling that someone is watching you from behind. Have you ever experienced this? If so, notice how the brain doesn't ask permission. It simply activates the alert, even without concrete evidence. This happens because the brain is not just an organ that reacts to the world. It is, above all, a predictive system. The human brain is constantly trying to anticipate what might happen in the next second. It analyzes patterns, subtle movements, almost imperceptible sounds, and even minute changes in light. When something deviates from the expected pattern, even if it's irrelevant, the brain can interpret it as a possible sign of something being present. And, instead of waiting for rational confirmation, it creates the sensation. It's as if it were saying, something might be wrong, pay attention. That's where this silent discomfort arises. The feeling of being watched doesn't stem from logic, but from perception. It happens before conscious thought, before rational analysis. That's why, often even knowing that no one is there, you still feel it. The brain has already made the decision for you. And this doesn't happen by chance. Throughout evolution, erring on the side of caution was a survival strategy. It's better to feel that someone is watching and it turns out to be nothing, than to ignore a real danger. The curious thing is that, in the modern world, this mechanism remains active, even when we no longer need it in the same way. Quiet environments, fatigue, stress, anxiety, and even excessive stimuli can increase these false interpretations. The brain enters a state of heightened vigilance and begins to fill in the gaps with hypotheses. And one of these hypotheses is precisely this: the sensation of invisible eyes watching you. Perhaps, as you listen to this now, a memory is surfacing. A specific moment when you stopped, looked around, and thought, why am I feeling this? If this video is already making sense to you, stick with me because we're only beginning to scratch the surface of this phenomenon. From here on out, we'll understand why the brain creates this type of illusion, which areas are involved in this process, and how emotions and mental states can intensify this feeling of vigilance, even when it doesn't exist. And perhaps that's exactly why this feeling affects us so much, because it touches on something profoundly human. It's not just about feeling that someone is watching, it's about realizing that the brain, even in silence, is always active, interpreting, protecting, and sometimes exaggerating. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far, or if you've ever experienced a moment like this. Reading about these experiences creates a powerful exchange because many people watch in silence thinking they are alone in this feeling, and they are not. While you listen to all this, it's worth noting how understanding how the brain works changes the way we relate to these experiences. And if this content is helping you look at your own mind with more curiosity and less fear, liking the video is a simple way to show that. This gesture seems small, but it greatly helps to bring this type of conversation to more people who also feel these things and don't know how to explain them. And if you enjoy exploring these mysteries of the human brain, these strange phenomena that everyone feels but almost no one talks about, subscribing to the channel is like saying, I want to continue understanding this. That's what keeps this space alive, growing, and allowing us to delve deeper and deeper into these topics that blend science, perception, and real human experience. Your participation here is not just support for the channel. It's part of building this curious, open community interested in understanding its own mind. Now, hold on to this idea for a moment because from here on out we're going to start going behind the scenes of the brain, understanding how it interprets the environment without you realizing it, and why, at certain times, it creates the clear sensation that someone is there, even when there's no one there. When we say that the brain is obsessed with vigilance, it's not just a figure of speech. It's a biological fact. The human brain was literally engineered to observe, scan, and interpret its environment all the time, even when you think you're relaxed. This constant vigilance didn't arise by chance. For most of our history as a species, being watched was almost never neutral. It usually meant danger. It could be a predator, a rival, an enemy, or someone about to attack. Being seen was a risk. And the brain learned this very early on. Because of this, the brain has never been trained to seek absolute tranquility, but rather survival. It doesn't function like a patient investigator waiting for concrete evidence. It functions like an alarm system. A system that prefers to err on the side of caution rather than underestimate. Between ignoring a potential risk and generating a false alarm, the brain always chooses the false alarm. This choice has shaped our entire way of perceiving the world. And it remains active today, even in safe, quiet, and seemingly controlled environments. This is where the feeling of being watched comes in. It doesn't arise because someone is there, but because the brain has identified something that deviates from the expected pattern. A tiny detail, a sound out of rhythm, a subtle change in light, an almost imperceptible peripheral movement. These signals in isolation mean nothing. But the brain doesn't analyze the world in isolation. It cross-references information all the time, seeking coherence, meaning, and, above all, security. When something doesn't fit, it reacts. This reaction doesn't happen on a rational level. It happens beforehand. First comes the sensation. A slight tightness, a shiver, a sudden focus on the surroundings. Only then does the conscious mind try to understand what's happening. And often it finds no answer at all. Even so, the body has already reacted. This happens because the brain makes decisions at deep levels, outside of your conscious control. It decides before you even realize it has decided. This surveillance mechanism is also deeply connected to our social side. The human brain dedicates an enormous amount of energy to monitoring other human beings. Gazes, expressions, intentions, judgments. Throughout evolution, being accepted by the group was a matter of survival. Being excluded could mean death. This created a brain that is extremely sensitive to the idea of being observed, evaluated, or judged. Even when you are alone, this programming remains active behind the scenes. That's why the feeling of being watched often arises precisely during moments of silence. When there are no clear stimuli, the brain begins to fill in the gaps. It doesn't cope well with emptiness. Silence is not relaxing for the brain, it's ambiguous. And ambiguity for a survival system is dangerous. So it starts to create hypotheses. Some are neutral. Others turn into that strange impression that someone is there, even when there isn't. Emotional states also greatly influence this process. A brain under stress, anxiety, or fatigue enters a protective mode. Vigilance increases. Perception becomes more sensitive. Small stimuli take on greater weight. This does not mean weakness or a psychological problem. It means that the brain is trying to protect you in the best way it knows how, using ancient strategies in a modern world. This behavior reveals something important about mindset and decision-making. Most brain decisions don't involve conscious thought. They happen quickly, based on past experiences, emotions, and learned patterns. When you feel you're being watched, the brain has already decided that the situation deserves attention. Reason comes in later, trying to confirm or deny the feeling, often without success. This leads us to a hidden truth about reality. The reality you experience is not a faithful copy of the external world. It is a construct, an interpretation. The brain doesn't show the world as it is, but as it believes is safest for you at that moment. This construct is dynamic, changing according to context, emotional state, and level of vigilance. And that's why two people can be in the same environment and feel completely different things. This journey of understanding completely changes how we perceive these phenomena. What once seemed strange or frightening is now seen as a reflection of the brain's intelligence. A system that prefers to exaggerate rather than fail. A system that has been trained to protect, even when there is no real threat. This has a direct impact on how we deal with our perceptions, emotions, and even our trust in what we feel. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding this obsession of the brain with vigilance opens doors to understanding other curious phenomena, other distortions of perception, and how emotions and expectations shape what we believe to be real. Before continuing, comment below. Does this make sense to me? There's something happening all the time behind the scenes of your perception that you almost never consciously notice. While you believe you're only seeing what's right in front of you, your brain is operating a parallel, silent, and extremely powerful system, peripheral vision. It's where what we might call a true invisible radar resides. A mechanism not designed to admire details, but to detect movement, change, and possible presence. And it's precisely there that much of the feeling of being watched originates. Peripheral vision doesn't work with sharpness. It doesn't see faces, define shapes, or clear outlines. Its role is different. It exists to perceive variations. A minimal displacement, a moving shadow, a subtle change in light, something that wasn't there a second before. For the ancestral brain, any unexpected alteration in the peripheral field could mean immediate danger. A predator approaching, someone moving silently, a threat outside the central field of vision. And this programming remains active, even when you're sitting on the couch or walking calmly down the street. The most curious thing is that the brain doesn't wait for confirmation. It doesn't say, let's check it out. It reacts. From the moment peripheral vision detects something out of the ordinary, the brain kicks in and starts filling in the information. It fills in the gaps even before you're sure of what you saw. This filling in isn't conscious. It's automatic. In fractions of a second, the brain transforms a vague stimulus into a clear hypothesis. Something is there. This is how an undefined shadow can become the sensation of a presence. A quick reflex can transform into the impression of a gaze. A movement that may not even have existed becomes, internally, a warning signal. And when this warning is activated, the body responds accordingly. Posture changes, attention narrows, the environment seems to become quieter. All this happens without you asking for it, without you deciding. It's the brain taking control to protect you. This ability to complete information is one of the greatest strengths of the human brain, but also one of the main sources of distortion of reality. The brain hates uncertainty. It prefers to create a plausible explanation rather than admit it doesn't know. This is a hidden truth about human perception. What you believe you are seeing is often an interpretation, not a faithful record of the external world. Peripheral vision provides fragments, and the brain assembles the story. This process has a direct impact on how we perceive our environment. In moments of silence, low lighting, or solitude, the peripheral radar becomes even more prominent. Without clear stimuli to occupy central attention, the brain becomes more dependent on this lateral surveillance system. And the more it depends on it, the more it interprets. The more it projects. The more it transforms small signals into significant meanings. There is also a profound emotional component to this mechanism. Internal states completely alter the reading of peripheral vision. A brain in a state of emotional alert, carrying accumulated stress, anxiety, or tension, becomes more sensitive to any variation. It's as if the radar becomes deregulated, amplifying signals that would normally go unnoticed. Small shadows gain weight. Irrelevant movements become suspicious. And the feeling of being watched arises as a direct reflection of this amplification. This reveals something important about mindset and personal journey. How you feel internally directly influences what you perceive externally. The brain doesn't separate emotion from perception. They go hand in hand. The world you see is, in part, a reflection of your internal state. And this is a powerful revelation because it shows that the experience of reality is dynamic, changeable, and profoundly subjective. When the brain completes a piece of information before you're sure of what you've seen, it's not lying. It's doing what it's been trained to do. It makes quick decisions based on old patterns. It transforms incomplete data into coherent narratives. This ability was essential for survival, but in the modern world it creates these small distortions, these strange sensations that defy conscious logic. Perhaps that's why this experience is so striking. Because it happens on a level that precedes thought. You feel before you think. You react before you understand. And only then do you try to find a rational explanation. Often without success. This generates discomfort, curiosity, and even fear. But, in essence, it's just the brain operating its invisible radar, mixing perception, emotion, and expectation. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this same mechanism that creates the sensation of presence is also linked to how the brain anticipates intentions, predicts behaviors, and constructs the sensation of continuous reality. Before continuing, comment below, does this make sense to me? There's a point where all of this connects even more deeply, and it revolves around a simple yet powerful idea. The brain doesn't wait for reality to happen. It's constantly trying to guess. Before anything actually manifests, the brain is already creating predictions, simulating scenarios, and anticipating intentions. This happens silently, automatically, and continuously. It's as if the brain is always a few steps ahead, trying to decide what's about to happen so you won't be caught off guard. This process is known as brain prediction. Instead of reacting passively to the world, the brain builds internal models of reality and compares these models with the stimuli received through the senses. When everything matches, the experience seems stable, predictable, comfortable. But when something doesn't fit perfectly, when there's a discrepancy between what the brain expected and what it receives, a strange sensation arises. An internal noise. A diffuse alert. And it is precisely in this space that the feeling of being watched is born. Imagine the brain as a stage director who already has a script in their head. It expects certain movements, certain continuities, certain patterns. When something deviates from this script, even if it's minimal, it tries to explain it. If it doesn't find a clear explanation, it creates a hypothesis. And one of the oldest, most deeply rooted, and most emotionally charged hypotheses is the presence of another human being. Someone who observes. Someone who follows along. Someone who evaluates. This anticipation of intentions is a direct legacy of our evolutionary history. Survival required quickly understanding what the other person might do. The brain learned to read signals before they became actions. A head movement, a change in posture, an unusual glance. All of this was interpreted as intention. And when there were no clear signals, the brain preferred to assume something was happening rather than ignore it completely. In today's world, this same mechanism remains active, but often without a real target. The brain still tries to predict intentions, even when there is no one there to have an intention. It detects ambiguities, gaps, small sensory inconsistencies and tries to fill them with meaning. When this prediction fails, when the brain gets the guess wrong, the feeling of being watched arises. Not because someone is observing, but because the brain expected something that did not materialize. This forecasting error is not a flaw. It's a natural consequence of a highly sophisticated system. A system that works better when it anticipates than when it expects. The hidden truth here is that the brain wasn't designed to show reality as it is, but to create a functional version of it. A version that helps you make quick decisions, protect yourself, and move forward. Absolute accuracy was never the primary goal. Survival was. Therefore, the feeling of being watched usually appears suddenly, without logical context. It doesn't ask reason for permission. It simply emerges. And when it emerges, it carries an emotional impact. The body reacts as if there were a real presence. Attention adjusts. The environment seems to change in density. All this happens because the brain has already entered social interpretation mode, even if there is no other person there. This phenomenon also reveals something important about mindset and transformation. Many of the experiences we consider strange are, in fact, the result of normal processes functioning outside their original context. The brain didn't shut down old programs. It simply adapted them to a different world. And, in this process, these borderline sensations arise, these experiences that lie between the real and the interpreted. Throughout our personal journey, we learn to trust our feelings a great deal. And most of the time it works. But experiences like this show that feeling is not synonymous with absolute truth. The sensation is real, but the cause may not be. This distinction is an important revelation because it changes how we deal with our own perceptions. Instead of fighting against them or interpreting them as something wrong, we begin to understand them as signals of how the brain is operating at that moment. When the brain anticipates an intention that doesn't exist, it's simply following its internal logic. It creates a provisional narrative to explain a world that, for a moment, has become too ambiguous. This narrative can be discarded seconds later when reason takes over. But the effect has already happened. The sensation has already been felt. The impact has already manifested itself. This leads us to realize that reality is a continuous construction, adjusted in real time. The brain is always testing hypotheses, correcting errors, and recalibrating its predictions. Some of these predictions go unnoticed. Others become striking experiences, like this feeling of surveillance without a clear origin. They attract attention precisely because they reveal the inner workings of the mind. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this brain prediction mechanism not only influences the feeling of being observed, but also how we interpret others' intentions, make decisions, react emotionally, and construct our perception of truth throughout life. Before continuing, write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." There is a silent factor that underlies all of this and often goes unnoticed: the emotional state in which the brain is operating. Anxiety, stress, and fatigue are not merely subjective sensations or passing discomforts. They profoundly alter the filter of perception. They change how the brain selects, interprets, and gives meaning to environmental stimuli. When these states come into play, the brain not only sees the world differently, it begins to predict the world differently. A brain in constant alert never rests. It lives in anticipation mode. Everything is potentially relevant, everything deserves attention, everything could hide some risk. This type of functioning doesn't arise because something is wrong with you. It arises because the brain was designed to react to excessive demand as if it were facing a prolonged threat. Stress, for example, is biologically interpreted as a signal that something needs to be resolved urgently. The problem is that, in the modern world, this state can extend for days, weeks, or even months. When this happens, the brain adjusts its internal parameters. It changes the threshold of what it considers dangerous. Things that were previously neutral are now interpreted as suspicious. Small stimuli gain weight. The environment seems more charged. Attention becomes fragmented. And in this scenario, the feeling of being watched finds fertile ground to emerge. Not because there is someone there, but because the brain is operating with an expanded threat map. Anxiety further intensifies this process. An anxious brain doesn't wait for solid evidence. It works with possibilities. It constantly anticipates, trying to avoid negative scenarios that may never happen. This creates a distorted perception of the environment, where the unknown becomes danger and silence becomes suspicion. The mind enters a cycle of overinterpreting signals. A noise becomes an alert. A shadow becomes a presence. A void becomes something hidden. Fatigue, in turn, reduces the brain's ability to filter out irrelevant information. When we are rested, the brain can ignore a large amount of unimportant stimuli. When we are exhausted, this filter weakens. Everything gets in. Everything competes for attention. And the more stimuli enter without organization, the more the brain tries to quickly impose meaning. It completes information, creates narratives, and makes hasty decisions. In this state, the feeling of vigilance appears more frequently because the brain does not have enough energy to analyze calmly. This is an important point about empathy. Many people interpret these sensations as a sign of weakness, instability, or something out of the ordinary. But, in reality, this is biology at work under pressure. It's the brain doing the best it can with the resources it has at that moment. It's not trying to scare you. It's trying to protect you, even if in an exaggerated way. There's a hidden truth here that often goes unnoticed. The brain doesn't separate emotion from perception. When you're emotionally overwhelmed, the world really does seem different. Not because it has changed, but because the brain has changed the way it presents it to you. This transformation of experience is subtle, yet powerful. It shapes decisions, influences reactions, and creates sensations that seem to arise from nowhere. Throughout the daily grind, we accumulate tensions without realizing it. Demands, worries, internal pressures, unresolved expectations. All of this builds up behind the scenes. And the brain responds by adjusting its mindset to a prolonged survival mode. In this mode, it prefers to err on the side of caution. It prefers to create false alarms rather than lower its guard. And the feeling of being watched is one of those alarms. The impact of this isn't limited to isolated moments. It influences how you move in space, how you react to quiet environments, and how you interpret ambiguous situations. A brain under prolonged stress tends to see the world as less predictable and more threatening. This doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It simply means the brain is trying to maintain control in a scenario it perceives as unstable. When we understand this, something changes. The experience ceases to be frightening and becomes understandable. Instead of fighting the sensation, we can observe it with more curiosity. We can recognize that this discomfort is a sign of an overloaded system, not a real threat. This change in mindset has a profound impact because it restores the feeling of autonomy and reduces the fear associated with the experience. These revelations show how sensitive the brain is to internal context. Perception arises not only from what is outside, but also from what is happening inside. Emotions, fatigue, and stress shape how the world is presented to consciousness. And this explains why the same person can have completely different experiences at different times in life, even when in the same environment. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding how these emotional states alter the filter of perception opens the way to understanding how the social brain, self-awareness, and the sense of judgment come into play in this experience. Before continuing, comment below, does this make sense to me? There is an even deeper layer behind this feeling, and it is linked to something that defines who we are as a species, the social brain. Human beings were not made to exist in isolation. From the earliest groups, our survival depended on coexistence, acceptance, and the constant reading of others. Because of this, the brain developed a refined ability to monitor how we are seen, evaluated, and interpreted by the people around us. Even when no one is present, this system remains active behind the scenes. The social brain functions like an internal mirror. It observes you observing the world. It monitors your attitudes, your posture, your decisions, and even your thoughts, always considering how this might be perceived by someone from the outside. This process is not conscious most of the time. It happens automatically like a silent gear that never stops. And it is precisely this constant internal vigilance that, at certain moments, projects itself outward. When this happens, the sensation is curious. What was previously just internal monitoring begins to be experienced as something external. Self-awareness transforms into a perception of surveillance. Not because someone is watching, but because the brain is so accustomed to operating under the gaze of another that it creates the sensation of that gaze even in their absence. It's as if the mind were saying, "What if someone were watching this right now?" This projection is a direct consequence of how we construct our identity. From an early age, we learn to see ourselves through the eyes of others. We are praised, corrected, compared, observed. The brain learns that being seen matters, that the gaze of others has an impact, that it can mean approval, rejection, security, or threat. This learning shapes our social mindset and leaves deep marks on how we perceive the world. Over time, the brain no longer needs a real observer to activate this system. It assumes that role itself. Self-awareness becomes constant. You observe yourself being yourself. And when this mechanism intensifies, especially in moments of silence, solitude, or emotional vulnerability, it can exceed internal limits and generate the sensation that there is an invisible external observer. This is a little discussed hidden truth. Often the feeling of being watched is, in reality, the feeling of intensely observing oneself. The hyperactive social brain creates a scenario where the gaze of the other is simulated. Not as something imaginary in a fantastical sense, but as an extension of a system that has been trained throughout life to function this way. Self-awareness has a huge impact on the decisions we make. It influences what we say, how we behave, and even how we feel about ourselves. When it intensifies, the external world begins to seem more meaningful. Every detail gains weight. Every silence seems intentional. Every absence becomes an implicit presence. The brain tries to give form to something that, in fact, originates from within. This process becomes even stronger when we are emotionally sensitive. Anxiety, stress, and fatigue, as we have seen, amplify this mechanism. The social brain goes into a state of alert, monitoring possible judgments, social risks, and invisible threats. Internal vigilance increases so much that it begins to seem external. And then the invisible eyes appear. Not real but felt. The most interesting thing is to realize that this isn't a gross error of the brain. It's an adaptation. A consequence of a highly sophisticated system that has been essential to our journey as a species. The problem isn't the mechanism itself, but the context in which it's activated. In a world where we spend a lot of time alone, overstimulated, or emotionally overwhelmed, this system can function out of sync. When we understand this, something changes. The experience ceases to be interpreted as something strange or threatening and begins to be seen as a sign of how the social brain is operating at that moment. The feeling of being watched reveals itself as a reflection of amplified self-awareness, a side effect of a brain that has never completely switched off from the gaze of the other. This revelation changes how we deal with these experiences. Instead of trying to push them away or fight them, we can observe them more clearly. We can recognize that the discomfort doesn't come from outside, but from within. That it doesn't indicate real danger, but an internal social system functioning excessively. This shift in perspective has a direct impact on how we interpret our own perceptions. Throughout life, our relationship with the gaze of others shapes our identity, our confidence, and our perception of reality. The social brain is powerful, and when combined with intense self-awareness, it can create very vivid experiences. Understanding this is part of a larger journey of self-knowledge, where we begin to see the inner workings of the mind with more curiosity and less fear. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we combine the social brain, self-awareness, and how the brain differentiates what is normal from what seems strange, we begin to understand why this feeling can arise without representing any real problem. Before continuing, write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." When this feeling arises, the first question that almost always comes to mind is silent, but weighty. Is this normal or is something wrong with me? This doubt is understandable because the experience is intense, unexpected, and stirs something very deep, the perception of safety. Feeling like you're being watched activates ancient layers of the brain, and when this happens, the mind immediately seeks an explanation. Often, this search ends up leading down paths of fear, bewilderment, or exaggerated interpretations. But the truth in most cases is much simpler and much less alarming. This feeling is common. More common than people admit. The difference is that few talk about it openly. When it happens, it's usually fleeting, lasting seconds or minutes, and disappears as quickly as it appeared. The brain creates the alert, tests the hypothesis, and when it doesn't find sufficient confirmation, it deactivates the signal. This is part of the normal functioning of a system designed to protect, not to offer constant comfort. The important point is to understand that the brain doesn't measure danger in the same way that reason does. It doesn't work with statistics or conscious logic. It works with emotional probability. If something seems even slightly out of the ordinary, it reacts. And it reacts quickly. This exaggerated protection isn't a flaw, it's a characteristic. A brain that doesn't exaggerate takes more risks. A brain that exaggerates creates false alarms, but keeps the body safe most of the time. There are times when this feeling can intensify. Periods of prolonged stress, high anxiety, extreme fatigue, sleep deprivation, or emotional overload increase the sensitivity of the surveillance system. The brain enters a state of continuous alert, as if expecting something to happen at any moment. In this state, neutral stimuli begin to be interpreted as relevant signals. The environment seems more charged, the silence heavier, the solitude more intense. Not because something is actually wrong, but because the brain is operating with an amplified threat filter. This doesn't mean you're losing control, nor that something serious is happening. It also doesn't automatically point to anything supernatural. The human brain has an enormous capacity to create convincing experiences without a real external cause. It constructs sensations based on expectation, memory, emotion, and context. And the more emotionally involved the experience, the more real it seems. There's an important hidden truth here. The brain wasn't designed to perfectly differentiate between what's real and what's merely probable. It works with approximations. It makes constant guesses. And when it's wrong, the mistake comes in the form of a feeling, not a logical explanation. That's why you can rationally know that nobody's there and still feel it. Reason and feeling operate at different speeds. Understanding this has a transformative impact. Instead of interpreting the experience as something threatening, you begin to see it as a sign of an overactive, not defective system. A brain that is trying to protect you more than necessary at that moment. This change in mindset reduces fear and restores a sense of control. Not because you gain control of the brain, but because you begin to understand its inner workings. It's also important to recognize that the brain responds to life's context. Changes, internal pressures, important decisions, unresolved conflicts, and phases of emotional transition increase perceptual sensitivity. The brain understands these moments as periods of instability and adjusts its behavior to be more vigilant. This is part of the human journey. It's not a sign of weakness, but of adaptation. When these sensations are rare, fleeting, and don't significantly interfere with daily life, they are part of the normal spectrum of human experience. They only become a problem when they are constant, extremely intense, or accompanied by other signs of profound suffering. Outside of these cases, we are talking about a healthy brain just being overly cautious. Realizing this changes your relationship with your own perception. Instead of fighting against what you feel, you begin to observe with more curiosity. Discomfort diminishes when it ceases to be interpreted as a threat. The experience loses its power when it is understood. And this understanding creates space for a more balanced relationship with your own mind. This revelation also invites us to look inward. The feeling of being observed often says more about our inner state than about our external environment. It reveals our emotional burden, our level of tension, our need for control or security. Looking at this honestly is part of a larger process of self-knowledge and transformation. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we begin to differentiate between an exaggerated protective reaction and what truly represents a risk, we open up space to understand how the brain decides what is normal, what is strange, and how these boundaries are constructed. Before continuing, comment below, does this make sense to me? When we look at this experience more closely, it ceases to be just a strange episode and begins to reveal something profoundly fascinating about the human mind. The feeling of being watched acts as a crack, a momentary opening that allows us to see how the brain constructs reality in real time. What you perceive as the world doesn't arrive fully formed in your consciousness. It is assembled, adjusted, and interpreted continuously, second by second, in a silent process that blends perception, emotion, memory, and expectation. The brain wasn't designed to register reality neutrally, like a camera that only records what's in front of it. It functions much more like an editor that needs to deliver a coherent version of the experience as quickly as possible. To do this, it selects information, discards others, fills in gaps, and creates connections that make sense at that moment. Most of the time, this process happens so well that you don't even notice it. But at certain times, such as when the feeling of being watched without a clear origin arises, this construction becomes visible. This experience reveals a hidden truth. We don't live in the world as it is, but as the brain believes it to be. And this belief is not fixed. It changes according to context, emotional state, and internal expectations. When you feel someone is watching you, the brain is cross-referencing incomplete signals with past experiences and future projections. It creates a provisional narrative to make sense of something that, for a moment, became too ambiguous. The most curious thing is to realize that this narrative emerges before any conscious reflection. The sensation comes first. The body reacts. Attention shifts. Only then does the mind try to understand what happened. This shows how consciousness is often a late observer of the brain's decisions. Reality has already been constructed when you begin to think about it. This process reveals how inseparable emotion and perception are. There is no such thing as pure perception, free from feeling. What you see or think you see always passes through emotional filters. The same environment can seem safe one day and threatening the next without anything external having changed. What has changed is the internal state. Perceived reality is a constant negotiation between what is outside and what is inside. Understanding this has a transformative impact on how we deal with strange experiences. Instead of interpreting them as glitches or signs of something wrong, we begin to see them as manifestations of a highly sophisticated system trying to fulfill its main function, maintaining coherence and security. The feeling of being watched is not a gross error, but a punctual exaggeration of a mechanism that, most of the time, works in our favor. This revelation also changes our mindset regarding certainty. What we feel with conviction doesn't always correspond to objective truth. It might just be the best guess the brain could construct at that moment. This doesn't invalidate the experience, but it puts it into perspective. The feeling is real. The emotional impact is real. The external cause often is not. Throughout our journey as individuals, we accumulate memories, learnings, and social experiences that nourish these internal constructs. The gaze of others, judgment, the expectation of acceptance or rejection leave deep marks. The brain learns that being seen matters. And this learning influences how we interpret ambiguous signals throughout life. At certain times, this interpretation manifests as a feeling of being watched. At others, as anxiety, discomfort, or restlessness. These are different expressions of the same process. When we understand this, something adjusts internally. The experience ceases to be threatening and becomes intriguing. It transforms into an invitation to observation. A reminder that the mind is always active, always creating versions of the world so that we can act, decide, and move forward. These versions are not always faithful to the facts, but they are almost always consistent with the internal state of the moment. This awareness changes the relationship with fear. Fear loses its power when it ceases to be interpreted as a sign of external danger and begins to be understood as a product of a temporary internal construct. This does not mean ignoring what one feels, but understanding where it comes from. This understanding brings more balance, more autonomy, and more clarity. The human brain is extraordinary precisely because it can create meaning where there is uncertainty. It prefers an imperfect story to emptiness. It prefers an exaggerated explanation to the absence of explanation. The feeling of being watched arises exactly at this point of tension between the need for meaning and the lack of clear information. It is the brain trying to fill a gap as quickly as possible. Upon realizing this, it becomes clear that many of the certainties we hold are momentary constructs. Reality is not something static but a constantly evolving process. And experiences like this remind us that what we feel with such conviction does not always reflect the external world, but rather the internal state of the system that interprets that world. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we begin to understand how the brain constructs reality in real time, an inevitable question arises about how many other sensations, decisions, and truths that we accept without questioning are also the result of this same silent construction. Before continuing, comment below, does this make sense to me? If you've made it this far, it's because this topic resonated with you on some level. And when we begin to understand how the brain constructs reality, how it anticipates, exaggerates, and sometimes deceives us in an attempt to protect us, something changes inside. The feeling ceases to be strange and begins to make sense. If this message was for you, leave a comment with the phrase, "I'm with you until the end." This shows me that this conversation has really stayed with you this far. If at any point during this video you felt understood, or realized something new about your own mind, liking the video is a simple way to mark that connection. It helps this content reach more people who also live through these experiences and don't know how to explain what they feel. And if you enjoy this kind of reflection, which blends science, perception, and real-life experiences, subscribing to the channel is a way to continue this journey with me. The idea here is precisely that, to look at the human mind with curiosity, clarity, and less fear. There's a video over here that complements this topic and delves even deeper into the inner workings of the brain. Click on it and continue watching.